Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So today we're going to be tackling a lecture on the impact of human activities on our ecosystems and health. How does this impact health? And so in this lecture, I'm going to be exploring the link between the environment, climate change, which we've talked about in a previous video, and public health. So why do ecosystems matter? So you might know what an ecosystem is because I briefly mentioned that in our previous video. But essentially, our ecosystems include the air, the water, and the land, as well as living organisms that sustain life. So you can think about the birds in the air, the fish in the sea, animals on the land, and humans. Where are humans in this ecosystem, right? We breathe in this air, we drink the water, we bathe in the water, and, we work on the land. And so there's again a lot of interconnection when I'm talking about global health and ecosystems. And really what we want to see in a healthy ecosystem um, is just the provision of clean air, clean water, access to food, and regulation of climate. So, having a balance between warmth, but also coolness. So if our place is too hot, then there's a lot of heat effects as a result of high temperatures, which lead to heat strokes, for instance, cardiovascular disease. And so, having this healthy ecosystem is really a mix of all of these factors. But really what I wanted to get into today in this video is to explain how human activities really disrupt a healthy ecosystem. And so this really leads to climate change, which we've talked about in our previous video, as well as poor health outcomes across the board. Okay, and really, I wanted to talk about air pollution. What is the impact of air pollution, right? So when we think about the air that we breathe, and all of the types of pollution. You might know already a lot of them, but a lot of our industrial processes and the emissions that result from these processes um, are a large contributor to the air pollution that we see globally. And then we can also think about vehicles, the exhaust from the vehicles, the emissions, and all the different chemicals that are released from, a vehicle's exhaust tailpipe, for instance, right? Different um, chemicals like lead, and carbon monoxide. And so these are the two main causes of air pollution that we see, but also deforestation and wildfires. So, there's a lot of wildfires in Canada and the United States right now, and it really affects the air pollution that we see and the levels that we see. But more importantly, how does this impact our health? So this can actually lead to respiratory diseases, right? Um, and there are a lot of people right now who might have a mild form of asthma, and that can actually exacerbate. It can make it harder for them to breathe and actually worsen their condition. Um, but also, it can actually affect cardiovascular disease as well. And this can actually lead to premature death. Um, and in terms of the environmental impact of air pollution, we can see how, a lot of even if we just think about the industrial emissions and the vehicle exhausts and how that contributes to air quality, it can actually cause things like acid rain. And again, this really affects biodiversity. So when we think about what biodiversity means, you can think about all of the species that are living in a forest. Um, when we um, when we create spaces that are unhealthy for them, as a result of wildfires, deforestation, it impacts their habitats, and so that's how we see a biodiversity loss. So 100 years ago from now, we probably had more species around than we do today, and that's because of a lot of these human processes that actually create unhealthy ecosystems, which result in biodiversity loss. And then we can also think about the fish in the sea. How many of the fish from 100 years ago are still out there right now, right? So a lot of our actions as humans have affected this. And I'll give you an example that's close to home. Well, my current home here in Manila. So the air pollution here that we see contributes to a lot of premature deaths annually, thousands of deaths. And so, again, still the same causes of industrial emissions as well as vehicle exhaust, since we have a lot of vehicles that are used every day, and the traffic doesn't help with that, right? The longer we are in traffic, the longer that we have a lot of these emissions. And so, that's really the impact of air pollution. And here I have a couple of images of just how the pollution really looks like on the ground. So here on the top left, this is a picture of a jeepney. This is one of the common forms of transportation in the Philippines. These were essentially jeeps used in the World War, and they were really created. They were already decommissioned, but this is really how the Filipinos commute now. It's through jeepneys. So they converted the traditional jeep from the war into kind of like a bus style where you have passengers sitting on the sides. It's a bench seat. But really, why I have a picture of the jeepney here is that it really releases a lot of smoke, diesel smoke, and in very great amounts. And you can see they actually were trying to measure how much diesel smoke and how many particles are being emitted by these jeepneys, right? There's a lot of jeepneys around. And so, yeah, this is one of, again, the vehicle emissions and how it really contributes to the poor air quality that we see today. This picture, I'm not sure where it's from, but there's a man in, what seems to be a body of water. He's surrounded with garbage pollution, right? Same thing here. There's open garbage burning in a rural community in the Philippines. They're burning garbage because there's no one that can actually dispose this garbage, or they might be living in a remote area with no access to these dumping facilities. Um, Here, there's kind of a landfill where, you can see it. It's kind of organized, the plastic waste here, but it's beside a body of water. So you can think about all the chemicals and how that leaches into this water here and how it can actually end off going as land runoff. And, there's a lot of downstream and cascading factors that actually a result of human pollution and, this in the form of garbage and waste. And here, there are two pictures here at the bottom. This is actually a controversy that happened, a few years back, which I remember, where this is in a Philippine, I believe, dock site, where they received a shipment of garbage, but it wasn't local garbage. It was actually garbage from Canada. So that was surprising and unexpected. But in within this shipment, this container of garbage, you had Canadian goods like a Sobeys bag, a Walmart bag, like Walmart plastic shopping bags, right? And this was shipped to the Philippines. So, we can just think about why this might have happened, and you can definitely look into maybe why or some speculation as to why this happened. But again, um, how each country deals with its waste and pollution is quite different. And so there was a lot of irresponsibility with this on how this was actually allowed to happen. And that brings me to water pollution, right? So what are the consequences? So again, because of our industrial economy right now, shaped through history, there are a lot of industrial processes that lead to industrial wastes, and that can be in the form of um, you know, um, the smokestacks, for instance, from these companies, right? The burning and then the production of different goods, which leads to air pollution. But it can also be agricultural runoff, for instance, chemicals that um, that get into the land and contaminate the land and the water, bodies of water, or agriculture. Maybe there's a nearby farm that's producing food that we eat. So you can just see how many things are interconnected here, as well as plastic pollution. And in terms of health effects that we see from water pollution, we can have different waterborne diseases, a high concentration of heavy metals in the water, like lead. So for instance, when you go to California and you go to Pier 41, I believe, there's a lot of seafood there. However, there was I believe, a California Proposition 65 that was enacted to actually give like a warning label to and you'd see it on the menu in the restaurants, as well as vendors were selling some of the fish and seafood, that there is a high presence of mercury and lead in the water, and that can actually um, affect us humans when we consume these different seafoods like fish, right? So again, this is a result of water pollution. And this really leads to impaired immune function for our bodies, right? When we consume a lot of these, contaminated foods, for instance, the fish, but also when we contract these waterborne diseases, this can really impair our immunity, our ability to fight infection and disease. Okay. And then in terms of the environment, so, we can think about the different animals within our marine ecosystem. This is a seal, but how that can actually destroy habitats. Um, and again, the loss of diversity, which I mentioned before, right? You might have seen this picture of, I believe it was was it a fish where it had a straw, or was it a turtle where it had a straw stuck in its nose pipe, right? So you can see how the pollution that we create actually impacts our animals. It affects their health, and that leads to a destruction and loss of biodiversity. So again, the plastic pollution that we see in the oceans really impacts a lot of the marine life, right? So when the plastic pollution gets into the food chain, it affects everyone, not just those at the top of the food chain, but everyone downstream. So that's the cascading effect that it causes. And in terms of our land, we've talked about deforestation in the previous video, but how our land essentially gets degraded over time, right? That's what we refer to as land degradation. Um, so due to our expansion, agriculturally, maybe we're creating more farms and more places that we plant vegetables, for instance. Maybe there's an area which is used for logging, so there's a lot of deforestation there. And there are also cases with illegal logging where people are taking down trees illegally. And so that leads to degradation of our land, right? And in terms of the health effects that we see, again, when we talked about the One Health approach in the previous video with zoonotic transmission, when we get too close to a lot of these animals and their ecosystems and habitats, we get introduced to disease risks. So vector-borne diseases, for instance, with mosquitoes. But in the case of zoonotic infections, a lot of respiratory diseases, like we've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, can actually stem from these close encounters with wildlife as a result of our degradation to the land, as a result of our human industrial processes. Oops. And again, this can also lead to malnutrition, as well as increased vulnerabilities to disasters. So, and in terms of the environmental impact, we can also see things like soil erosion. So, and as well as biodiversity losses, which I've already mentioned. And, it really impacts the ability of the earth to actually absorb the carbon. So, we're already impacting the environment on this chemical level, right? The ability to absorb carbon and reduce it from the ecosystem. So really, our human actions are creating a lot of poor environmental health impacts. And so one tangible example that I can give is the deforestation efforts in the Amazon rainforest. And this really accelerates climate change and again reduces the biodiversity that we see. And when we go back to water and how this affects, how our pollution affects the wildlife, this example of overfishing can also lead to marine degradation, right? So, and this is again a result of high demand for seafood, right? Because who doesn't like their salmon? Who doesn't like their squid, right? Um, Shrimp and fish, right? There's high demand for a lot of seafood, and so this leads to a lot of techniques that have been quite disruptive, but also destructive. And so, and there are many areas where there is a lack of this regulation and monitoring. So you can have illegal fish farmers, for instance, who are overfishing. There are some states in the US, I believe, which have created limits on how many fish or maybe how many crabs in Maine you can actually fish. But you know, that's just a couple of examples where there is strict regulation, right? Where if you have actually catch, maybe a certain species, you have to throw it back into the water. And there's a limit to how many you can actually catch in a day, in a week, or in a month, right? And you need to have proper licensing for that. But again, this really leads to a lot of downstream health effects. Loss of nutrition for a lot of the coastal communities can occur. So, and as well as, again, increase in exposure to contaminants, especially from, again, the industrial processes. In terms of the environmental impact, when you have this collapse of fish populations, this again leads to reduced um, and destruction of biodiversity, but it also disrupts the food chain, right? So you can think of the food chain on land with the different animals, but you can also think of the marine food chain, right? Who's at the top of the food chain, and how does this affect the rest of the population when you have, um, a certain species collapsing because of our environmental actions, right? Like overfishing. And in Southeast Asia, this is actually a very, very huge threat, overfishing, because again, the marine biodiversity isn't what it was 100 years ago, but as well as the local economies, right? Especially in here in the Philippines, where seafood is really a big commodity, it can actually affect those who are selling the fish farmers, but those who are actually contributing to the economy, and that's their livelihood. The- All of these things are really interconnected and can affect one another. And so how do we connect now? How do we make this step from environmental degradation and connect it back to um our model that we've developed on climate change in the previous video? So again, we have a lot of these greenhouse gas emissions, right? And these, for example, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, all of these emissions. You can even think about farts from, a cow, for instance. That leads to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And this affects our atmosphere, right? But also, again, it's a result of deforestation and again, industrial processes and even industrial agriculture. Think about how many companies right now are using a lot of pesticides, right, to preserve their produce, right? It's unhealthy, not just for the environment, but also unhealthy for the humans who are consuming this food. And then again, we have a lot of consequences like rising temperatures, extreme weather events that result, and as well as sea level rise because of these climate change health impacts. And again, as I've mentioned before, we have a lot of heat related illnesses that are a result of rising temperatures like cardiovascular disease, heat strokes, right? But also the displacement of different habitats, different animals, as well as human environments. If one environment is unsafe to live in because it's too hot, or maybe there's severe drought where there's no water, then that's an unsafe place to live. It can cause displacement of communities. And imagine for a scenario with sea level rise, how does this impact those communities who are living there, right? They have to move, they're displaced, and then they have to find another place to live. right? As well as vector-borne diseases. And again, these are diseases from mosquitoes like malaria and dengue fever, right? That result from um, the mosquitoes. And so again, lots of health effects. And again, another example I can give from the Philippines is that given the increasing risks of typhoons and the severity of typhoons, this really impacts the locals who are living. And again, this is connected to the climate change processes that we are currently seeing around the world. And this is just one example from the Philippines. And how does this impact humans on the center? Again, when we take this approach, which emphasizes humans, how are we affected in the end? So we can think about direct health impacts like respiratory diseases, right? Waterborne diseases and illnesses, as well as malnutrition, right? The lack of adequate nutrition. Indirectly, we can think about how a lot of these events, like for example, typhoons, water and food shortages in the environment, this can lead to a lot of mental health issues, as well as um, think of those communities who are displaced as a result of um, these these health issues that are a result of climate change and environmental degradation. Those who may be displaced, they can have a lot of these mental health issues and environmental stress that's associated with that, right? And then we can focus in on who might be the most vulnerable. These are certain populations like like children, those who might be elderly, those who may also be elderly and immunocompromised, right? Their immune system is already compromised, as well as those who are marginalized in an area. They would be the most affected. And again, those marginalized communities might be those who are living below the poverty line, who cannot sustain themselves economically. So we really need to focus on a lot of these vulnerable populations when we look at the impacts of climate change and the impact of our human activities on the ecosystem. And so an example I can give are a lot of communities around the world who are affected by natural disasters. It's not just typhoons, but it can also be earthquakes. They will have long-term mental health challenges. There may be trauma that's involved, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, right? So when we talked about health, in the previous video, I like to take a holistic approach to health, where health is not just, and this is based on the World Health Organization's definition of health. It's not just the absence of disease or infirmity, and the absence of a biological lesion, right? For example, a cancer or a tumor. That's not what being healthy is. It's the complete state of physical within the body, mental, and social. So mental within the brain and social well-being are connections, right? So it's a combination of the physical, mental, and social well-being that contributes to to good health. And so, you can just think about how all of these factors combine within a lot of these communities that are affected by disasters as well, right? Okay, so I've talked a lot now about all of these processes, how that's leading to poor health and poor ecosystems. But I'm going to give now some ideas on maybe how we can protect ecosystems. A lot of these things you're already doing, maybe in your workplaces or in your schools, but I'll just list four for you to see. So the first one being reducing plastic use and waste. Of course, we've heard about straws and plastic bottles, trying to reduce that with using reusable bottles, for instance. So a lot of us are doing this already. But we can think about ways where we can actually promote the growth and then of new land, right? Of new plant life on land. So, I know Mr. Beast is doing that with planting trees, his planting trees initiative. So again, promoting reforestation, but also having sustainable land use practices. So maybe let's try and use less pesticides, right? For instance, for many companies, so that it doesn't affect us on the long term, right? being exposed to these chemicals and pesticides. We can also support many policies, and we don't have to be a policymaker. We don't have to be a government official to do this. Just at the basic and lowest level, at the grassroots level, we can support a lot of these policies through advocacy, through a lot of these initiatives that are led at a grassroots level to actually protect our biodiversity, whether it's marine biodiversity, like the fish in the sea, um, but it can also be things like advocating for air pollution and air quality, right? And this really reduces a lot of the carbon emissions that we are seeing, right? And there's a trend over time we've been seeing, just an increase in these human and industrial processes that would lead to carbon emissions. And so this is taking a policy approach to mitigate a lot of these impacts. And finally, this is my favorite one because I always like taking a health education and health promotion approach when talking about public health, where the importance of educating communities on preserving ecosystems, um, and really stressing the fact that we can all do our own parts, whether it's in our homes, in our establishments, our businesses, our schools, our workplaces. We can do so much just at that level to preserve our ecosystem, right? And really, in conclusion, our human activities are really reshaping our ecosystems, as I hope I've proved through all of these slides, through our activities, the ways we pollute the environment, and how this contributes to climate change, right? And how it has a lot of downstream health effects, especially on humans. Protecting ecosystems is essential, right? And this is again with the idea that we need to safeguard human health, right? So we don't become this boiling frog, um, like I mentioned in the previous video with the analogy, and really with the effort of sustaining and ensuring a sustainable future for all, for our future generation, for our children, for our children's children, right? So for the next generation. And finally, like I mentioned in the last slides, we need to act collectively, not at an individual, at a community level, right, within our organizations and establishes and businesses, and really stress the policy level of intervention, how how policies can actually help us mitigate these impacts, right? So you can think about the legislation on um, vehicle emissions, right? For instance, policies on how much emissions can a vehicle produce. You can think about the policies for industrial sectors, right? For instance, Tesla. What are the policies that actually limit them from, using energy and producing and releasing chemicals into the environment, right? So when we're more aware of what's going on at the policy level, what's controlling a lot of these establishments, um, that can actually lead to human behavioral change. So actually changing what goes on in these systems that lead to a lot of these um, poor ecosystem impacts that we see, which again contribute to climate change effects. And so collective action is needed. And I believe that you who are watching will also be a part of this, right? I believe that. And so I hope this lecture gave you a good introduction of how our human ecosystems are connected, but also how this relates to climate change from the previous video and what we can do to tackle all of these effects. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.